Bedtime Stories. Usborne first reading The Hare and the Tortoise, retold by Myri McKinnon, illustrated by Daniel Howarth. Harry Hare loved running more than anything in the world. Every morning, he woke up and went for a run. Then he ran to work, ran around all day, and ran home. Everyone said he was the fastest hare around, maybe the fastest hare in history. Harry was sure of it. Tom Tortoise worked with Harry. All day long, he heard Harry boasting. He didn't think Harry was so special. Harry was always laughing at him. "Take your time, Tommy!" One morning, Harry was feeling very pleased with himself. He ran to work in record time. "I must be the fastest creature in the world," he boasted. "Let's have a race to prove it." Harry couldn't believe it when Tom Tortoise plodded over. "I'll race you, Harry," he said quietly. "Tommy, slow coach? Are you serious?" asked Harry. "You wouldn't even get started." "I mean it," said Tom. "Let's have the race next Saturday at 10 o'clock. You choose where to race." For the next few days, the animals talked about nothing else. The story was in all the newspapers. It was even on television. Harry trained extra hard. He woke up early in the mornings and went running in the evenings too. He knew he would win, but he wanted to win by miles. He chose a good long course for the race. Tom Tortoise didn't seem to be training at all. Perhaps he thought there was no point. At last, Saturday arrived. All Harry's friends came to watch him race. Tom's friends were there too, but they didn't look quite so happy. It was a beautiful day. Harry saw some television cameras and did a little running specially for them. Tom just kept on talking to his friends. Soon, it was time for the race to begin. Harry was already at the starting line. Tom slowly ambled over. "On your marks, get set, go!" shouted the umpire. Harry raced off and disappeared almost at once. Everyone laughed as poor Tom plodded over the line. As soon as he was out of sight, Harry stopped beside a tree to rest. After all his early morning training, Harry was very tired. Nobody was looking. He had plenty of time to sit down for a while. He would still win the race easily. His eyes started closing. Why not have a nap? That would make it even funnier when he won the race. He settled down in the shade. Soon he was asleep. Meanwhile, Tom Tortoise was slowly making his way along the course. Most of the animals had gone straight to the finish line. Only Tom's friends stayed with him. Nobody saw Harry sleeping under his tree. Hours passed. The sun was setting and the air was cool. Harry woke with a start. Where was he? Suddenly, he remembered the race. He hadn't meant to sleep for so long, but he could still beat Tom. Harry felt much better after his nap. He did a few stretches, then raced off. He could see the finish line now. There was a huge crowd, and they were already cheering. At that moment, he saw a small, brown shell shape coming up to the line. Harry felt cold all over. Surely that wasn't Tom? He ran faster than ever before. Yes, he could do it! The cheering grew louder and louder. Harry dived over the line, but he was too late. Tom Tortoise had won, and he didn't even look out of breath. Usborne first reading, The Hare and the Tortoise, retold by Myri McKinnon, illustrated by Daniel Howarth. Bedtime Stories. Bedtime Stories. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Hoffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. Cinderella. Once upon a time, there was a nobleman who had a sweet wife and daughter. But his wife died, and his second one was horrid. She had 2 daughters, whose bad tempers had given them ugly faces. They were mean to their stepsister Ella. She had to sweep the cinders from the grate. So they called her Cinderella. One day, the king's son sent out invitations to a grand ball at the palace. The ugly sisters spent ages deciding what to wear, and Cinderella had to help them get dressed and brush their hair. There was no question of Cinderella going to the ball in her rags. When the ugly sisters had left for the ball, Cinderella burst into tears. "How I wish I could go too!" she cried. Suddenly, her fairy godmother appeared. "Don't cry, child," she said. "Of course you can go to the ball, but first we'll need a few bits and pieces. Get me 1 pumpkin, 6 little mice, 1 large rat, and 6 lizards." Well, Cinderella couldn't think how a pumpkin and some animals were going to get her to the ball, but she did as her godmother asked. Her fairy godmother waved her wand and whoosh! The pumpkin disappeared, and in its place stood a beautiful coach. Then she waved her wand again. The 6 little mice turned into a team of handsome carriage horses. The rat was soon a rather fat coachman, and the lizards became 6 footmen. So now, Cinderella had a lovely coach to take her to the ball, but she was still in her rags. Her godmother smiled and tapped her once with her wand. Immediately, Cinderella was dressed in shimmering gold. "Now off you go," said her godmother. "But remember, at midnight, everything will go back to the way it was, so you must be home before then," Cinderella promised. Then stepped into her beautiful coach. The 6 white horses set off toward the king's palace. Everyone at the ball stopped dancing when the mysterious stranger arrived. Cinderella looked so beautiful in her gold dress that everyone thought she was a princess from a foreign country. Even her 2 stepsisters were fooled. The prince was just as curious as everyone else. From the moment Cinderella came into the ballroom, he danced with no one else. By the end of the evening, he was madly in love with his beautiful princess, and he didn't even know her name. And Cinderella was just as much in love with the prince. But as they were dancing, Cinderella suddenly heard the chimes of the palace clock. "Oh no!" she cried. "It must be midnight!" Cinderella ran away from the prince, out of the ballroom, and down the palace steps, losing one of her glass slippers along the way. By the time she reached the bottom step, The clock had finished striking 12, and Cinderella was in rags again. The prince ran after Cinderella, but all he found was the beautiful glass slipper from the steps. "Send out a proclamation," he said. "I will marry the person whose foot fits this slipper. We'll ask every woman in the kingdom to try on the slipper." So the prince went to every house in the kingdom, and soon he came to the house where Cinderella lived with her stepsisters. Of course, the ugly sisters were very eager to try their luck. But no matter how hard they pushed their big feet into the glass slipper, it didn't fit. So Cinderella came forward to try on the slipper. To the amazement of her stepsisters, it fitted perfectly. The prince looked up at Cinderella's face and recognized the beautiful princess he had danced with at the ball. So he married Cinderella. And unlike the stepsisters, they lived happily ever after. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Hoffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. Cinderella. Bedtime stories. Bedtime stories. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Hoffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. The Selfish Giant. There was once a giant who wasn't nice at all. He went away to visit a friend and didn't come back for 7 years. While he was away, children came to play in the giant's lovely gardens. They were happy and forgot all about him. Then the giant came back. "What are you doing?" he bellowed, and all the children ran away. So the giant built a tall wall and put up a notice warning the children to keep out. At first, the giant was pleased. Then he noticed that no birds came and sang in his gardens anymore. And worse, it was always winter. The giant became sad. Then one morning, the song of a bird woke the giant. He looked out and saw that the children had come back. They had crept through a hole in the wall, and now the gardens were full of flowers and birds. The giant tore down the wall and promised never to be selfish again. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Hoffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. The Selfish Giant. Bedtime stories. Bedtime stories. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Hoffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. Sleeping Beauty. There was once a king and queen who waited a long time to have a child. When at last the queen gave birth to a baby girl, they were so excited that they held a big party to celebrate her christening. The king and queen invited all 7 fairies in their kingdom, who came with very special presents for the baby. The king had solid gold plates, knives, and forks made for them. But there was an 8th fairy who had been forgotten. She came stumping into the castle. Quickly, the servants laid a place for her at the table. but the plate, knife, and fork weren't made of gold. One of the younger fairies, sensing trouble, hid as soon as it was time to give the presents. The first fairy gave the princess the gift of beauty. The second gave good temper. The third gave grace. The fourth gave a wonderful singing voice. And the fifth and sixth fairies bestowed gifts of dance and music. Then the angry fairy said, "And when she is 16, she will prick her finger and die." Imagine everyone's horror. But the young fairy in hiding came out and said, "She will not die. She will fall asleep, and so will all the courts. After 100 years, a prince will wake up our little princess with a kiss." The next day, the king banned all needles from the kingdom. But when the princess was 16, she stumbled across a secret staircase in the castle. At the top was a woman spinning at a wheel. The princess had never seen a spinning wheel and wanted to touch it. Immediately, the spindle pricked her finger and she fell down. Her parents found her and laid her on the best bed in the castle. Then they fell asleep too, along with the servants, cats, and dogs. 100 years had passed when a young prince found a huge hedge of thorny roses. As he touched them with his sword, they sprang apart. Behind the hedge was a castle. The prince went inside and found everyone fast asleep. The prince roamed through the castle until he found the room where the princess lay. He bent down and kissed the sleeping beauty. The princess smiled and sat up, astonished to find the prince there. The prince and princess soon fell in love. Meanwhile, everyone in the castle was stirring. The wicked fairy spell was broken at last. And as for the prince and princess, they lived happily ever after. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Huffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. Sleeping Beauty. Bedtime Stories. Bedtime Stories. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Huffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. Diamonds and Toads. There was once a widow with 2 daughters. The younger one was a good-natured girl who always had a smile on her face. The older girl was bad-tempered and greedy like her mother, and they were always mean to the younger girl. One day, they sent her to the well to get water. There she met an old woman who asked her for a drink. "Of course," said the girl. Then the woman revealed herself to be a fairy, and in return bestowed a secret gift upon the girl. When the girl got back home, she was scolded for being late. And when she opened her mouth to explain, out fell flowers and diamonds, and all sorts of precious jewels, for this was her gift. "Quick, go to the well too," said the mother to her older daughter. The daughter went and met a young woman who asked her for some water, but the greedy girl refused. Then the fairy, for that was who she was, rewarded her with an unusual gift. When the grumpy daughter returned home and opened her mouth to complain, to everyone's horror, out dropped toads and lizards and snakes. The younger sister was thrown out of the house, but she was rescued by a prince. And when he saw how beautiful she was and what valuable things fell out of her mouth, he asked her to marry him. But no one wanted to be near the older sister. She lived alone for the rest of her life. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Huffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. Diamonds and Toads. Bedtime Stories. Bedtime Stories. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Huffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. The 12 Dancing Princesses. There was once a king who had 12 beautiful daughters. He was very fond of them and didn't want them to leave home. So every night he locked them in the bedroom they shared. But every morning he found their satin shoes worn out. The king couldn't understand how this was happening. So he said that anyone who could discover where the princesses went dancing could marry one of them and become a king. But no one could. One day, a soldier came to town and read about the rewards. On his way to the palace, the soldier met an old woman. She told him not to drink the wine that the princesses would give him at bedtime. She also gave him a magic cloak to make him invisible, so that he could follow the princesses. The soldier was made welcome at the palace and given fine new clothes. But when he was given a cup of wine at night, he only pretended to drink it. Just as well, because there was a sleeping potion in it. The soldier pretended to be fast asleep, but all the time he was watching from the room next door. He saw the oldest princess tap her bed, and a secret passageway appeared. There was a staircase under the bedroom floor. The soldier watched as the princess disappeared one by one. Then he leaped out of bed and put on the magic cloak so that he could follow them without being seen. In his haste, the soldier stepped on the dress of the youngest princess, who was the last to descend the secret staircase. "Someone's tugging at my dress," she complained. "Nonsense," said her sisters. "There's nobody there." Next, they passed the woods, where all the trees were made of shimmering gold. The soldier snapped off another twig, startling the youngest princess again. "Surely you heard that noise?" she asked her sisters. When they got out into the open air, the princesses walked through woods in which all the trees had silver leaves. The invisible soldier snapped off a twig to take back with him. The noise made the youngest princess jump. Finally, they traveled through woods where the trees were covered with sparkling diamonds. The soldier broke off a diamond twig. But when the youngest princess cried, "What was that loud snap?" her sister said, "It was a gun fired to welcome us." On the other side of the diamond woods was a blue lake. 12 handsome princes stood ready, each waiting to row a princess across the lake to a castle. So the soldier quickly got into the boat, carrying the youngest sister. When the sisters reached the beautiful castle, they danced the night away with their partners. At the end of the night, the princess rowed the princesses back across the lake, and this time the soldier sat in the oldest sister's boat. The tired princesses went straight to bed, taking off their tattered shoes. The same thing happened on the next 2 nights. Then the soldier showed the king the silver, gold, and diamond twigs, and took him to see the secret staircase. The 12 sisters looked on in disbelief. "Congratulations," said the delighted king. And just as the reward said, the soldier was allowed to choose a princess and inherit the kingdom. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Hoffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. The 12 Dancing Princesses. Bedtime Stories. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Hoffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. The Frog Prince. There was a pretty little princess who lived in a castle near a dark forest. On hot days, she liked nothing better than to play with her golden ball under the shade of the trees. One day, she dropped the ball into a deep well. The princess wept bitterly at the loss of her ball. Suddenly, an ugly old frog appeared. "Whatever is the matter?" he asked. "I've lost my golden ball," she cried. "What will you give me if I get it for you?" asked the frog. "My jewels and my crown," said the princess. "No good to me," said the frog. "But if you promise to love me and let me eat from your plate and sleep in your bed, then I will get it." The princess promised without thinking. So the frog dove into the well and brought her back the golden ball. But as soon as she had it in her hand, the princess ran off home. "Wait for me!" called the frog. The princess forgot all about her promise. But the next day, when she was having dinner with her father, there was a knock at the door, and in hopped the frog. The king made the princess tell him the whole story. "Of course, you must keep your promise," he said sternly. "Lift the frog onto the table." So the princess had to share her dinner with the frog, but it took her appetite away. When it was time for bed, the king made his daughter carry the frog upstairs to her bedroom. How the princess didn't want a cold, clammy frog in her bed. But she knew that her father would be angry if she didn't share her bed with the frog. So she let it hop onto her pillow. "Now, you must kiss me good night," said the frog. The princess scrunched her face and closed her eyes. Then she gave him the smallest kiss. But when she opened her eyes, the frog had gone, and in his place was a handsome prince. "You've broken the spell," he said. The prince was so grateful that he asked the princess to marry him. And since she liked him much better as a prince than as a frog, she said yes. He took her to his palace, where they lived happily ever after. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Hoffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. The Frog Prince. Bedtime Stories. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Hoffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. The Princess and the Pea. There was once a prince who was looking for a wife. Only a real princess would do. And he was very fuzzy about what she must be like. He went on long journeys to find the right one. But every princess that he found had something wrong with her. One has bad-tempered. One was too tall. One wore silly clothes. And one had too many dogs. Then one night, in the middle of a terrible storm, there was a knock at the castle door. Outside stood a very wet and bedraggled girl who said she was a princess. She certainly didn't look like one. The queen had an idea. "We'll soon find out whether she's a real princess or not," she said. "I have a test that will prove it." She found a hard-dried pea. Then she invited the girl to stay the night. After the girl had been given a hot bath and a dry night dress, she was shown into a splendid bedroom. But the queen had put the dried pea on the bedstead and ordered the servants to pile 20 soft mattresses on top of it. In the morning, the poor girl said she had had a dreadful night. "I was so uncomfortable," she said. "There was something hard in the bed, and I tossed and turned all night." "What a sensitive creature," said the prince. "Only a real princess could feel a pea through so many mattresses." So they married and lived happily ever after. As for the pea, it was put in a glass case in the palace museum, and you can see it there to this day. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Hoffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. The Princess and the Pea. Bedtime Stories. Usborne first reading, The Boy Who Cried Wolf, retold by Mayuri McKinnon, illustrated by Mike and Carl Gurton. Sam lived in a little village in the mountains. Every day, he took the sheep from the village up the hill to a grassy meadow. "Here we are again." He watched them from morning until evening. La la la. "This way, Mutton Brain." Then he took them home again. Every day was the same. Same old mountains, same old trees. Sam was lonely, and he was so bored. All his friends were down in the village. He tried talking to the sheep. "And how are you today?" "Bah." But they didn't have much to say. "Nobody ever comes up here," moaned Sam. "Nothing ever happens." One day, he had an idea. "I could make something happen." He ran down the hill to the village. "Help! Help!" "What's the matter?" "Come quickly! A wolf!" he shouted. "A wolf has come out of the forest!" Everyone ran up the hill with him. "Hurry! My sheep!" Puffing and panting, they reached the meadow. Of course, there was no wolf. "All that way for nothing?" The sheep were quietly eating their grass. The villagers were angry, but Sam just laughed. "That was funny." "No, it wasn't." A few days later, Sam was bored again. He ran down the hill to the village. "Help! Help! What's the matter now? Come quickly! A wolf!" he shouted. "A wolf has come out of the forest!" Some people didn't believe him. "Oh, yes? We'd better make sure." But most ran up the hill to see. Puffing and panting, they reached the meadow. Of course, there was no wolf. The sheep were quietly eating their grass. "What are you grinning at?" Everyone was very angry, but Sam just laughed. A week later, Sam was bored again. He ran down the hill to the village. "Help! Help! There really is a wolf! Come quickly!" Most people didn't believe him this time. Just a few ran up the hill. Puffing and panting, they reached the meadow. "You think you're so clever?" Of course, there was no wolf. The sheep were quietly eating their grass. Now everyone was furious. Sam laughed and laughed. A few days later, a wolf did come out of the forest. Sam was terrified. He ran down to the village as fast as he could. "Help! Please help!" Nobody believed him. "Do you think we're so stupid?" "Promise you, there's a wolf!" Sam begged them to come with him. "You have to help me!" This time, they just laughed at him. In the end, Sam had to go back up the hill all alone. The wolf had killed some of the sheep. The rest had run away. Sam stayed in the meadow until it was dark. Finally, the villagers came to find him. "I told you!" "Our ship! No!" "Why didn't you believe me?" he asked. "You always told lies before." They said, "I'm sorry. I've learned my lesson. Never again," said Sam. Usborne First Reading: The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Retold by Mairi McKinnon. Illustrated by Mike and Carl Gurton. Bedtime Stories. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Hoffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. The Fisherman and His Wife. There was once a poor fisherman who lived with his wife in a hut by the sea. Every day, he went to fish in the sea with his rod and line. One day, he caught a huge flounder who begged not to be killed. "I am an enchanted prince," it said. "I wouldn't taste nice at all. Put me back in the water." When the fisherman came back home empty-handed, his wife scolded him. "Haven't you caught anything today?" "Nothing but an enchanted prince," replied the fisherman. "And didn't you ask for a reward? Go back, you fool, and ask for a house." "Flounder, flounder, come to me," called the fisherman. And the magic fish came back. "I'm sorry, but my wife wants a new house in return for saving you." "Go home," said the flounder. And the fisherman went home and found his wife in the sweetest little cottage. But the wife wasn't satisfied. "Go back and ask for a castle," she demanded. So the fisherman went back to the sea and called the flounder again. When he got home, this time he found a huge castle with towers and a drawbridge. "This is more like it," said his wife. But before long, she sent him back to sea again. This time, she wanted to be the king, and that night, the fisherman returned to a king's palace. Next, the wife wanted to be the emperor. When the fisherman got back from that errand, he could hardly find his wife in the vast imperial palace. She was surrounded by guards and servants. "Surely, are you happy now, wife?" pleaded the fisherman. She thought for a bit and then said, "No, I want to be God." The fisherman went back to the founder with a heavy heart. "She wants to be God," he whispered. "Go home," said the founder. And when the fisherman returned home, he found his weeping wife back in their poor old hut. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Hoffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. The Fisherman and His Wife. Bedtime Stories. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Hoffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. The Snow Queen. Once, there was a boy called Kay and a girl called Gerda, who were best friends. They were as close as brother and sister, and they lived next door to each other. Roses grew in the window boxes of their two houses and entwined together. In the summer, the children could sit on their balconies and talk to each other. In the winter, they played in each other's houses. One winter, when Kay was visiting Gerda and her grandmother, the children were reading their favorite book by the fireplace. Suddenly, Kay called out in pain. "My heart!" he cried, "and my eye!" Two splinters of glass from an evil magician's mirror had pierced Kay's heart and eye. Now, his heart was as cold as ice. From that moment on, he didn't want to play with Gerda anymore. One day, when Kay was playing on the ice, he tied his sled to that of a mysterious stranger. It turned out to be the Snow Queen, and she wouldn't let Kay go. She carried him away to her palace. Gerda couldn't understand what had happened to Kay and searched for him everywhere. In the end, she left their village determined to find him. After weeks of searching, she met a talking reindeer who promised to take her to the Palace of Ice, where the Snow Queen was keeping Kay a prisoner. Gerda had never been so cold in her life. The palace was made of ice. She ran through halls of icicles and corridors of packed snow until she came to a vast room with a frozen lake in the middle. And on the lake sat her old playmate. "Kay!" cried Gerda. But he did not know her. Gerda ran across the lake, slipping and sliding. "It's me, Gerda!" she said, but still he did not recognize her. Gerda could not bear it. She started to cry, and her hot tears fell on Kay's chest, melting the splinter of magic glass inside his heart. Then Kay cried too, and the splinter in his eye was washed away. Now they were friends again. Kay and Gerda returned home. Gerda's grandmother was waiting for them, and the roses were in full bloom. When they looked in the mirror, Kay and Gerda saw that they had now grown up, but they still felt like children at heart. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Hoffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. The Snow Queen. Bedtime Stories. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Hoffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. Rumplestiltskin. Once upon a time, there was a miller who boasted to the king that his daughter could spin straw into gold. "Oh, really?" said the king. "Then bring her to me. Such a skill will be very useful in my palace." The miller's daughter came to the palace. She was horrified to learn what her father had been saying. "Here is a room full of straw, my dear," said the king. "If it is not spun into gold by morning, you will die." So the poor girl was locked up in a large storeroom, with lots of straw and a spinning wheel. She had no idea what to do, so she burst into tears. Suddenly, a funny little man appeared and asked what was the matter. When she told him, he said, "What will you give me if I do it for you?" "My necklace," said the girl, and the little man agreed. The little man set to work, and soon the room was full of reels of gold. The miller's daughter looked on in amazement. In the morning, the little man disappeared. When the king came in, he was delighted with the girl, but he was greedy too. So he gave her an even larger room full of straw to turn to gold. The girl was even more desperate. Then, as if by magic, the little man appeared again. "What will you give me this time?" he asked. The girl gave him her ring. But on the third night, when she was locked in a huge barn, she had nothing left to give the little man. "I'll take your firstborn child if you marry the king," he said. And marry the king was just what the girl did, because he was so pleased with all the gold. He didn't ask the girl to spin any more gold, but a year later, she gave him something more precious, a baby son. The queen had forgotten all about her promise to the little man. Then one day, he appeared and demanded the baby. She was so upset that he took pity on her and said, "If you can guess my name within the next 3 days, you may keep the child." For 2 frantic days, the queen guessed. Casper, Melchior, Big Ears, Balthazar, Bottlenose? But nothing was right, so she sent her servants out far and wide to search for unusual names. The next day, a servant came back and said he had seen a funny little man dancing around a fire in the forest, singing, "I'll win the baby and the game. Rumplestiltskin is my name." So when the little man came back, the queen said, "Is your name Wayne? Is it Darren? Is it perhaps Rumplestiltskin?" The little man jumped up and down with rage. "Who told you? Who told you?" he roared, stomping his foot on the ground so hard that it went straight through. He disappeared and was never seen again. A first book of fairy tales, stories retold by Mary Hoffman, illustrated by Julie Downing. Rumplestiltskin. Read it yourself. Disney, Aladdin, Level 1 by Lady Bird. Once there was a poor boy called Aladdin. He lived in the city of Agrabah. Aladdin dreamed of a better life. The Sultan of Agrabah had a beautiful daughter called Jasmine. The Sultan told Jasmine that she must marry a prince. But Jasmine didn't want to get married. She ran off into the market. There she met Aladdin, but the palace guards took Aladdin to Jafar. Jafar was the Sultan's advisor. He took Aladdin to a cave. Inside the cave, Aladdin found a magic carpet and an old lamp. He picked up the lamp and rubbed it. A genie appeared. He gave Aladdin 3 wishes. "I wish to be a prince," said Aladdin. Aladdin took Jasmine for a ride on the magic carpet. But Jafar threw him into the sea. The genie saved him. Jafar wanted to marry Jasmine. He stole Aladdin's magic lamp. Jafar rubbed the lamp and the genie appeared. "I wish to be a sorcerer," said Jafar. Jafar turned himself into a snake and fought Aladdin. "Now I wish to be a genie," said Jafar. Jafar was trapped forever. Like all genies, he became a prisoner in a lamp. Jasmine told the Sultan that she wanted to marry Aladdin. With his last wish, Aladdin set the genie free. Jack and the Beanstalk. Always Learning by Pearson. Once upon a time, there was a little boy called Jack. He lived in the forest with his mother. They were very poor. All they had was a cow. One day, Jack's mother said, "Jack, you must take the cow to the market and sell her." On the way to the market, Jack met a man. He said to Jack, "I will give you 5 magic beans for your cow." Jack said, "What can I do with 5 beans?" The man smiled. "They will make you very rich." Jack decided to exchange the cow for the beans. When Jack arrived home, he gave the beans to his mother. She was very angry. "Beans? What can I do with beans?" Jack's mother threw the beans out of the window. Jack cried. "But they were magic beans!" His mother shouted, "There is no such a thing as magic." The next day, Jack went out into the yard. The beans had grown into a huge beanstalk. Jack started to climb up the beanstalk. Finally, Jack reached the top of the beanstalk and saw a castle. He headed for the door. He went inside and met a giant woman. She said in a loud voice, "Hello, little boy." Then she said in a soft voice, "Shh, come with me. My husband is an angry giant, and he doesn't like strangers." They went into the kitchen. Jack hid inside the oven, and the giant arrived. The woman said, "Hello, dear. Here's your dinner." The giant had a bag full of coins. He ate his food quickly. Then he started to count the coins. The giant smiled as he counted each coin in the bag. After so much counting and a huge dinner, the giant fell asleep. Jack climbed out of the oven and ran to the door. The giant woman ran after Jack with a bag full of coins. "Take these coins and buy some food for you. Hurry, before my husband wakes up." Jack quickly climbed down the beanstalk. When Jack arrived home, his mother said, "Where have you been?" Jack smiled. "I climbed up the beanstalk and saw a giant." Jack gave his mother the bag of gold coins. She shouted with happiness, "Now we can buy some food at the market." The next day, Jack climbed back up the beanstalk and sneaked back into the castle. He heard the angry giant shouting, "Grrr! Someone stole my coins, but I still have my treasure." Jack could see a hen in front of the giant and a big golden egg coming out of the hen. There were many golden eggs all around the hen. Jack waited until the giant fell asleep at the table. Then Jack grabbed the hen and ran towards the beanstalk. The giant chased Jack down the beanstalk. Jack was smaller and faster than the giant. He shouted, "Mother, come and help me!" Jack and his mother cut down the beanstalk with an axe. The giant had to climb up back to the castle. Jack and his mother took care of the hen, and they shared the golden eggs with all the village. Nobody ever went hungry again. Jack and the Beanstalk. Always Learning by Pearson.